All right, hello. Welcome to Everyday Anarchism. The moment I started talking, Anthony, the cicadas just went in this arc. So my guest today is Professor Anthony Kaldellis, who's a professor at University of Chicago. Is that
That's
right
right.
now? And you were at Ohio State University, but now you're
Yes.
at UCHI. And the reason why I mentioned the cicadas, dear listeners, is because Professor Kaldellis and I are both in highly cicadan locations. So if you don't like the sound of buzzing cicadas, first of all, don't live in North Carolina or I guess on the Corinthian Peninsula of Greece. And secondly, don't listen to this podcast. Sorry about that if you're really a cicada hater.
We can't control the cicadas.
At least it would be human folly to try, I believe.
And it's too hot to close the windows. Sorry.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, so you've written a number of books on a wide range of subjects related to the Byzantine Empire, which I understand that even that is. So let me take a step back then. I said we were going to start with your book, The Byzantine Republic. Let's start instead with the Byzantine Empire, which is not I feel like, well studied or understood, at least in my experience in academia in the United States, not covered and taught in the same way that something like ancient Greece, especially Athens, is taught, or the Roman Empire. And in fact, one place that your book starts is the problem of naming this thing and understanding it, because one way to understand it is the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire starts in this city-state of Rome, but is ruled from a bunch of capitals in a bunch of different places. And then for a long time, it's not ruled in Rome. It's ruled in a few cities, including Ravenna, Milan, and Constantinople, also known as Byzantium. And then it's just still ruled from Constantinople for 1,000 years after it ceases to be ruled from Rome, Ravenna, or Milan. And in that sense, one thing to say is that calling this thing Byzantium or the Empire of the Greeks is, if not necessarily a mistake, it comes with a certain ideology, and you could just call it the continuation of the Roman Empire or the Byzantine Republic. So is that enough for you to start and respond and clarify and contest?
Yeah, sure. That was pretty concise. Let me just say that what we're talking about today is a very specific society that kind of held it together for over 1,000 years. And it is traditionally called the Byzantine Empire, but it's been called that as a kind of rubric for naming it since the late 19th century. So it's not a very old term. What it really was is the eastern portion of the ancient Roman Empire. And as your readers will know, the Western Roman Empire fell at some point. We don't need to get into how or why or when. But the eastern part of the empire carried on, and that is the society that I study. So from the 3rd or 4th century AD to the 15th century. So about almost 12 centuries, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, that was its capital, carried on. It is a society that was primarily Greek-speaking. It was Christian Orthodox after a certain point, and it was Roman in its fundamental social, legal, and political institutions. And its inhabitants called themselves Romans. They were Romans. This is what they would have called the ethnic term. Religiously, they were Christians or Orthodox, whatever. People have lots of identities, but in the way in which we classify states and so on through ethnic or national or state names, it was Roman, and the state itself was called Romania, or the Roman polity, or some variation thereof. Anyway, so all the other terms that your audience may have heard, including Byzantium or Empire of the Greeks or whatever, these are very inherently political labels that were used by other people, not the people we're talking about, to describe this state.
And so the idea behind you're labeled the Byzantine Republic is that there was a Republican ideology alive in this empire. I have that right?
Yeah, so the first point here has to do with my usage. So I use the term Byzantine only in like book titles and the most overarching rubrics in order to identify in my scholarship what field I'm addressing, what I'm talking about. Because if I were to use the term Roman, which in a certain sense I would be entitled to do, I think, because it is used pervasively in the sources that I study, it would create confusion. So if we use Byzantine as just referring to a phase of the existence of the Roman polity, which is really all it was, then that's fine for now. My field is about to have that discussion about whether this term is appropriate or not. But anyway, we're not here to discuss the term Byzantine so much as we are to discuss the mechanics of its sort of political sphere, where I introduced the term Republican. And so this requires some context and explanation, because when you say Republican in the United States, you mean something very, very different than if you say it in France, right? Like, so these terms have very, this term has a wide variety of meanings in different countries and different traditions. So let's start with one obvious, well-known fact, which is that the Byzantine Empire, it was a monarchy. Now, I mean, it's probably best if we just refer to it as a monarchy rather than an empire. It's questionable whether it was an empire in the way in which we mean that term in English. So it was a monarchy. It had very well developed institutions of governance. This was not at all a kind of decentralized sort of Middle Earth kind of kingdom where there's a faraway king, but he has nothing to do with the Shire, and maybe they remember him, or maybe some tax collector shows up every once in a while. No. It was a highly organized and bureaucratized society by medieval standards. In fact, by ancient standards as well. Extensive bureaucracy, land censuses, administrative penetration of society at all levels, really. So anyway, lots of overlapping institutions of law, taxation, the church, military recruitment, and so forth. And at the head of all those institutions was a monarch, whom we call emperor, but there's nothing that corresponds to that term in the Byzantine Greek vocabulary. The title was Vasilevs, which means king or monarch. And now certainly he was.
Well, can I jump in here and say, I mean, this sounds, vassal is what is the word that the listeners might know, right? So we're talking about a feudal relationship, and you can tell me how much this is useful as in there's. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all.
Okay.
You should banish all ideals of feudalism entirely from this picture. They are completely inappropriate.
Well,
let me just say that. No. This is a
vassal get into the English language as part of a feudal relationship. Then, well,
that is Western medieval terminology that even Western medieval historians are very uncomfortable with right now. So there have been Western medieval historians who have proposed that feudalism is not a good concept for writing Western medieval history. But let me just say that it is wholly irrelevant in almost all periods for the Eastern Roman experience. I mean, when portions of the Byzantine Empire are conquered by crusaders in the 13th century, and especially by French knights who definitely bring their own ideas about feudal social orders to Greece, then you begin to get some local approximations of that, especially in dealing with the Westerners. But these we do not take to be sort of normal or normative for the Eastern Roman experience or way of doing things. So we're just going to restrict ourselves to like pre-Crusader influence to that period. So before the 13th century. The relationship of the monarchy to the rest of society is institutional and not feudal. In other words, there are no hereditary titles of nobility. There are no lords that have rights over lands that are inherited. There are no barons sort of who are ensconced in some region. There is nothing whatever like this. It's a bureaucratic state where people hold office at the pleasure of the government, and they tend to rotate in and out of offices. The provinces are ruled by provincial governors who are sent out by the center and are replaced on a fairly regular basis because, for various reasons, it was good to have turnover. The monarch does not engage in like internal diplomacy with barons and lords and counts and so forth, but gives orders to his officials. Now, whether they carry out those orders is a different thing, but the relationship is an institutional one. There is no right to titles or to the throne. There is no heredity in this matter. So it functions far more like a modern bureaucratic state in this regard than to a feudal one. Sorry, I had to jump in there because
No,
it's not feudal.
Oh, I'm already off the rails in that I wasn't trying to suggest that it was a feudal state, merely that word has infiltrated the English imagination somewhere, although admittedly I don't know the history of the word vassal. I guess it's very briefly, I don't think I've covered feudalism in any way on this show, and so a lot of what you said feudalism, which is a concept, as Anthony Kaldellis just said, that is incredibly contested even among the people who study what would have been called feudal Europe until relatively recently, is really about the holding of land, the holding of title, and as opposed to a authoritarian, not authoritarian, let's say linear bureaucratic hierarchy that goes straight down from someone through an administrative state. You've got a series of people who are in charge of individual plots of land or individual polities or whatever you want to call that, who have power within their own realm, but are also responsible to a realm higher than them, and it all gets sort of complicated and messy. The best way that I can explain this, if this still works, is if you have seen Game of Thrones. That is a fantasy of feudalism in which there is a king, and then there are lords who answer to that king, and then there are lords who answer to those lords. And really, you get a civil war when a lord decides he's not going to answer to a king, but then you can get a sort of sub-civil war when a lord decides he's going to go with the king as opposed to the lord he is supposed to answer to. And you can think of all of these interpenetrating bubbles of authority that in some ways stack and in other ways are independent of one another. So that is feudalism. And what you're telling us is that model of all of these interpenetrating bubbles and different levels and instability and who is at which level and who is accountable to whom is not a good way of thinking about what are we calling this? The Eastern Roman Empire?
You can call it the Eastern Roman Empire, the Eastern Empire, or Byzantium. That's fine. I mean, so long as we know what we're talking about, I'm not afraid of words. So you can call it Byzantium or the Byzantine Empire for the sake of convenience. But so yes, you're right. That's not the social dynamic at play, though occasionally you have events that from a distance seem to mimic it. So you have plenty of civil wars in Byzantine history, but they're far more like military coups. So it's usually a portion of the army and its leadership who are generals. They're not local lords or anything. They're generals appointed by the center who decide, I'll make a bid for the throne, and use the army that was entrusted to me by the monarch to replace the monarch. That's how it works. And so then you start canvassing among the officers, and you try to get as many as you can on your side. For military coup, there are also palace coups, right? So this could be a relative of the emperor or someone else at the court who canvasses for support in the court to overthrow an emperor who is perceived to be weak or unpopular. Those are two very common ways of overturning the current occupant of the throne. And another one would be a popular uprising in the streets by the people of Constantinople, usually. None of these events are structured according to relations of vassalage, right? There's hierarchy involved, right? So you can have, I mean, a general rebelling against the monarch is an act of rebellion in a hierarchical system that violates well, sometimes oaths, just sometimes what's expected of an officer. It's overthrowing the regime. So sort of it's illegal. So you're breaking the law in order to change the regime. So anyway, so from a distance it can look similar, but once you get into the granular details of it, it functions in very different ways. So for example, in Game of Thrones, you could not, in that kind of world, you couldn't very well have someone from a very low social class rise to the top. You'd have to be from one of the family.
At any point in Game of Thrones, meet professional soldiers. I cannot think of a single professional soldier in Game of Thrones, except for when they go to the other continents, which are Roman influence. So Game of Thrones is a feudal fantasy in which you literally cannot imagine someone doing what you can do in 21st century Western culture, which is joining an institution, being trained up by that institution, demonstrating your merit, and then getting in charge of something. That existed in Byzantium. It does not exist at least in our imaginary feudalism.
Yes, many emperors in Byzantine history rise through the ranks of the army or the navy or something like that from obscurity, from social obscurity. I think that happened. And it's possible in part because, like I said, there is no law that establishes, castes or, nobility or whatever. I mean, there's one law for all Roman citizens. That's just a kind of fundamental feature of Roman law from antiquity that is actually accentuated in the Byzantine period, but whatever. So let's get to the fundamental point that you raised earlier, because we have to describe the monarchy and how it works a little bit more in order to talk about how it can be subverted and what the antithesis of the normal working of the bureaucratic institutions is, because there is an antithesis. It's very powerful. So the monarchy is, in theory, in charge of all of the sort of legal or legitimate institutions of governance. In other words, commander-in-chief, the legislature, the judge. So when in cases of appeal or legal, confusion or clarification, it all comes to the emperor. The emperor issues the laws. The emperor is in charge of the bureaucracy, appoints officials, changes the nature of the administration. So there's no separation of powers as we understand it in the modern Republican tradition, right? That we got to be clear about that. Now, in practice, of course, when emperors are running all of these institutions, governing them, they are relying on other people, lots of people, experts, whatever. But in theory, as Truman said, the buck stops with me. So in other words, the emperor is, in theory, the authority that legitimates the operation of the government and the changes that take place in it. Now, having said that, there are a number of limitations that the emperor faces and that the entire administration faces. And we'll get to those limitations in a moment. They're very important. So what I try to do in the book, The Byzantine Republic, is shine a very, very different light on how this system works. And so here's the first of two major points of revision. And I think we're going to come to the second one later on. It's also aligned with the interest of your podcast. So the first one is that historians very often have these two major blind spots. And the first major blind spot is that historians tend to suppose that the theories of power, the theories of government that emanate from the government itself, from the people with the most official institutional power, that those theories of government are the ones that are actually operative and normative and accepted by everybody.
Yeah, good,
Right.
excellent.
Yeah, is this not so?
This is one of the key insights that I try and get at this on this podcast over and over again, is if you assume that the official account of power is how power works, that suggests that you have not lived a day in your life, because we all know that power does not work that way in our lives.
Exactly. And it just so happens that in medieval societies, the people who are best positioned to articulate, disseminate, illustrate, right, and promote their view of how the government works and how it should work are usually the ones who are in power within it. And this is certainly the case in Byzantium. The ideas about power and the government that we have tend to come from the court and from writers associated with the court. And they had an incentive and the means to construct a very elaborate sort of quasi-theology of power that did a lot of things and a lot of contradictory things, but the goal of them was to basically persuade anyone at the time, usually elites, but also us, posterity, in effect, that the emperor is anointed to rule by God and so forth. And your audience can imagine how the rest of it goes. This isn't actually a theory of absolute power. And by the way, I'm skeptical of even theories of absolute power, even in the period of European history that is supposed to be the absolute rule of the absolute kings and divine right and so on. When you start prodding those societies and even their official literature, the theories of absolute power are full of holes, even in the official literature. But anyway, nevertheless, the Byzantine court and its spokesmen try to present this image of order, an order that is sort of brought and maintained by the monarch and the institutions of the monarchy and all of the apparatus of power that it commands. It's a very seductive picture. Historians have been seduced by it. And it's visually illustrated, with like icons or ivories of the emperor literally crowning, the emperor of God crowning the emperor, angels, flanking the emperor and so forth. And especially in the 1930s, a group of historians active then constructed what the next century of scholarship sort of operates within this notion of this kind of Byzantine quasi-theocracy that is sort of divinely legitimated and so forth. And now, by the way, the 1930s are not a normal time in human history. And those scholars are responding to all kinds of things happening in Europe, from Russia to wherever. And anyway, that's a whole other topic. But I have a lot of problems with that model, in particular because it relies heavily on court art and court propaganda, specifically orations praising the emperor. And so those two things have been, taken together as like this defines the Byzantine political sphere. It is a kind of relationship between the emperor and God. And everyone else just kind of gazes upon the emperor and God in submission and admiration or whatever, and just kind of follow orders. The problem is that in practice, that's not what we see, right?
So this narrative does not account for civil wars and rebellions and street riots, right?
Yes. And let's just say that Byzantium had probably the highest frequency of incidents of civil war than any other society tested. I mean, I think there are periods of Chinese history that are just as bad, but let's not get into the problems that define those kinds of wars. We'll just stick to the Eastern Roman Empire. So it's been calculated that on average is a civil war every 10 years. Sometimes they're more dense, sometimes they're more spread apart. This is over a course of like 1136 years. So that's a lot of wars and plots and attempts to overthrow the emperor. And they come from, as I mentioned earlier, the armies, they come from the court, and they come from the street of Constantinople, usually, but not exclusively. And so then we're faced with the following problem. Well, the official theory can't explain this. It can characterize it. Right? So they're characterized as like evil rebels and like whatever, the mob or diabolical inspiration. This is if the attempt to overthrow the government fails. If it succeeds, then this is divinely inspired, and because it's the next emperor who's retroactively legitimating the process that brought him to the throne. And so it doesn't, the official theory doesn't explain the practice. And so, one question that I had is, why do we reconstruct the political sphere from court orations, for example, and not from the historians, who give a very different picture of how the whole thing works? And that's where it's from that tension that the concept of a Byzantine Republic emerges. And the Byzantine Republic, very broadly, I can give a more specific definition, but very broadly, it refers to the fact that political power and the legitimation of political power is much more contested in the society, with many more stakeholders involved in the allocation and legitimation of power. And that the book tries to flesh out that dynamic. So what happens when we try to explain this gap between the reality and the theory, and it requires that we bring in more constituents. And it turns out that the theory is, in fact, I think, very defensive. In other words, the emperor and the court present the throne as exalted precisely because it's insecure and precisely because they have to compensate for how vulnerable each individual emperor is. All right. Now, let me add one caveat here. So lest your audience get any ideas that I'm not actually saying, these moments of political instability are never, ever, ever about changing the structure of power. Right? They're not a revolution along the French lines or the American, yeah, also in somewhat, and not as much as the French, but close. So it's not about changing the nature of the regime, or it's always about changing the people who are running it and reforming, let's say, some of the abuses or inadequacies of the previous people who are being overthrown because they are deemed, inadequate or unjust. Right? So the structure tends to remain in place. This is how you have a state and society that survived for so long. It's a very resilient, robust structure, yet there's a lot of turmoil within it. And so that's what the book is trying to sketch. This isn't a revolutionary society. The ideas were always conservative, but the allocation and the legitimation of power are highly contested, all the way down the social scale, really. And so I situate this kind of official picture of how the state works in a broader context of sort of social contestation that involves many hundreds of thousands of people.
I have so many. I mean, I have at least 2 or maybe more hours worth of questions and thoughts in response to all of this. So I'm going to try and there's so many ways to go. First, I want to contest the idea that it's not a revolutionary society, because if it is a instantiation of the Roman Republic, then just like the American, so I'm an Americanist, and in the season this is coming out, there's going to be an episode on Voltairine de Cleyre who makes this exact argument about the American Republic, which is this is a country founded on a revolution with revolutionary institutions and the claim that you are not allowed to alter those revolutionary institutions. So insofar as this is a republic, insofar as this is an inheritor of the Roman Republic, the founding of the Roman Republic is the overthrow of the kings. Does that make sense? So it's a revolution, it's a conservative revolutionary or even reactionary revolutionary regime, which is just my way, Anthony, of contesting the basic premise of the knowability of the governmental structures of societies, as opposed to making a specific, I mean, you're the expert on Byzantium, but as an expert on the United States, this is a conservative revolutionary country all at the same time, and that's why so often it makes so little sense from the outside or even from the inside. The Second Amendment was created to prevent the formation of a national army, and we have members of the United States military who go to protests in favor of the Second Amendment. That's the kind of thing that is impossible to parse out, even as I'm living through it in the United States. So trying to parse that out in the Byzantine Republic is, of course, going to be much, much more difficult.
Yes, it is in large part because of the mismatch between our language and our expectations and what we find in the pre-modern sources, or in the original sources, if you want to go back to the American Revolution. And so republic is a very difficult term, as I mentioned, right? But also these distinctions that we operate with, like republic and empire, right? So the revolutionary moment that created the Roman monarchy that I'm talking about is not the overthrow of the kings in 510 BC or whatever. Yeah. It's the fall of what we call the Republic, in the late Republic in the 1st century BC, that led to the rise of to the origin of the imperial office and Caesar Augustus and so forth. And here, again, there's a big mismatch between how that event is understood in American mythology and what actually happened. We can get into this if you want. I mean, it is the origin of the East Roman monarchy is the same as the origin of the Roman monarchy under Caesar Augustus, which in a way is a very revolutionary moment, but one to which many thousands, if not millions of people contributed. It wasn't some internal coup involving 15 people. It wasn't like Emperor Palpatine with his, thug Sith Lord overthrowing some institution through magic. No. This was involved huge civil wars, riots in the city. I mean, political disturbance on a tremendous scale before the position of a sort of quasi-monarch emerged to provide some kind of stability in the end. And the thing is that in the American mythology, the Republic is always treated as a positive type of regime, and the empire as a kind of exploitative, repressive, totalitarian, whatever.
Yeah.
When that's not actually what happened. The late Roman Republic was a hugely corrupt, oppressive oligarchy of some senatorial billionaires that were blocking the system from working in the way in which it was supposed to. The Roman Republic was supposed to be much more democratic, that is, working for the needs and solving the problems of the Roman people. like it was straight out understood to be that way. It was a sort of populist regime, regardless of who's actually in charge. It was supposed to be working in the interest of the Roman people broadly. And this faction of oligarchs were blocking that from happening to the degree that they precipitated a bunch of wars. It was not Caesar who crossed the Rubicon and started the war. The Senate, under this faction, led among others by Cato, had already declared war on Caesar because, for whatever reasons, anyway, we get into that. It's a long story. Yeah, but the emperors were the ones who restored stability, and the Caesars were arguably more popular, both Julius and Caesar Augustus, for doing so than were the old sort of Republican oligarchs, and were praised accordingly. And they inaugurated the period of longest peace and economic prosperity that part of the world had ever seen, and were understood to have done so.
Yes.
Okay. So yes, the regime. Now, yeah.
I want to jump back real quick to something that you said earlier in terms of this idea that, absolute monarchy had never existed. I think it was pretty well understood that absolute monarchy had never existed. But in the 18th century, in Europe, in the context you were talking about, in the 18th century, the concept of absolute monarchy was really invented by people like Voltaire in an attempt to restore the Augustan moment. Now, you and I know that Augustus was not an absolute monarch, but that was the idea, to replace a plutocracy, an oligarchy, with a mythical benign father. It's why George Washington has a Roman mural of him in the Capitol, the apotheosis of Washington. Yeah, because this idea of the absolute monarch, which you're quite right, never existed in the European context, was a European dream of a Roman emperor who would do precisely what you said, come in, straighten things out, and rule, for the people, and maybe in some way by the people, but that part was less important than the taking of the power away from the elites who were ruining everything and giving it to the so-called good elite. You can also say that anarchism is born in this moment when someone, Godwin is often labeled as the first person to raise his hand and say, and who is this good elite that that is going to, that can be invested in absolute power? Hence, I know I mentioned you in our emails, Madison's idea of a sort of a federal government with absolute power that also exists within a federal system that is kind of feudalist, and also that federal government with its absolute power that is also not absolute is distributed across all of these ways and channels. And this is the 18th century moment, is this struggle of how do we create this centralized administrative state that can deliver an Augustan style polity without giving us a Nero. That's the 18th century moment.
Yes, how to avoid the excesses of monarchy, but also the excesses of democracy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. So in the 18th century context, republicanism was increasingly defined as a non-monarchical regime that was also not a democracy. Because the founders, among many other people, had very, very mistaken ideas about ancient Athenian democracy and how it functioned or didn't function. They were just way off on this. But whatever, that's okay. So I'm going to ask the audience to think, to hypothesize that republicanism need not be anti-monarchical. And in fact, for most of its history, the term was not. So when we're talking about the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Roman Empire from its beginnings, it was perfectly well understood to be the Roman Republic. And so here audiences are going to do a double take and what are you talking about? We all know that the Republic ended and the empire kicked in. But no, this is not at all what happened. that those terms are very modern. I think they're 18th century, if not they're 19th century division. So as far as the Romans were concerned, the Republic, the Res Publica, is like the common interests of the Roman people, right? Both abstractly, but also as a state, their institutions of governance, the quote state property, things like the forum, the roads, the whatever, and the diplomacy and the armies, all of these things that pertain to the common interests of the Roman people are the Res Publica, the Republic. And there's no sense that this Republic ended with the transition from the regime, let's say, of the Senate and the consuls to that of the Caesars. What you have is just a res publica under different governance. It was perfectly well understood even before this revolution, say by Cicero, that a res publica, say the res publica of the Roman people, could be governed by an oligarchy, by a monarchy, or even by a democracy. Cicero preferred a kind of oligarchical senatorial mode of governance of the republic, but he understood that you could have a monarchy governing the republic. This is not a conceptual problem for the Romans. They didn't like it, they didn't prefer it at that time, or at least his class didn't. But you could just as well have a republic under a monarch, which is what the Roman Empire was. And so you don't stop getting references to the Roman Republic in imperial literature. That's just what they called it all the time. So this distinction between republic and empire is a modern one. It's a false one by Roman term standards, right? So even under the empire, this sort of general ideology prevails that the republic of the Roman people continues to exist, and that the political authorities, in this case, the imperial administration, is beholden to it in the sense that, like, its job is to promote the welfare of the Roman people. And it continues to be that all the way down to 1453. Like this is the fundamental ideological foundation of even the Byzantine Empire. It's the same one, that this whole political apparatus exists in order to promote the welfare of the Roman people. And the emperors keep saying this over and over and over and over again. For 1,000 years and more. Now, that you can take that on the one hand to be sort of cynical propaganda, it's like, yeah, sure, Jeff Bezos is also doing this for the good of mankind, or whatever, right? But these claims, when they're made by a political authority, create an actionable, an actionable foundation, right, for reaction. In other words, if the authorities are claiming, and this is even sort of enshrined in laws in many ways, that the overriding principle behind all of this is the good of the Roman people, when the authorities are failing to deliver on that, they thereby become illegitimate. Not the structures of power, but the specific people who are wielding them. And they need to be replaced. Now, so an emperor can do something that irritates or alienates a part of the polity. So persecutes a minority, whatever. And that minority might regard the emperor as sort of, okay, you're now illegitimate. You're dead to me because you harm my interest. You're not promoting the good of the Roman people. And if that minority is small enough, they won't be able to do much about it. But if the regime is failing on a pretty large scale to either deliver on that promise or to persuade the population that they're delivering on that promise, there's both things. There's the reality and there's the rhetoric, right? That's when you start to get people thinking about overturning them. And that's why you get like 100+ coups and civil wars, because in a sense, this is politics, which means that, everybody's looking over their shoulder and everybody's looking to move up. And so weakness is pounced on. And weakness is both, the way we think about it, like you have a weak emperor who just can't manage the job, but also an emperor who's unpopular. This can be someone who's otherwise perfectly confident and well-meaning, but who has just been very unlucky. And so all of those people are targeted for replacement by other, various constituencies of the Republic, which includes people of Constantinople. They're very politically active, even though, and this is very important, there are no political institutions to channel the political power of the people of Constantinople. They don't do this through elections, right, every 4 years or whatever. This is the crucial point. They act on their own outside of institutions, literally by gathering in the hundreds of thousands in the street and blocking off the palace to the point where the emperors literally can't do anything, or just expressing their displeasure. And that can bring the government to a standstill and often does force regime change. Like, we want someone else to do this now.
Right? And this is what we call anarchy. Right.
This is what you call anarchy. Yes.
Exactly. Right. I like you as in me. Right. This was the moment that I thought, ooh, I should have this guy on the show, because it's not just that anarchy or mob rule existed in Byzantium, but it's your claim that in some ways, despite there not being an institutional outlet like an election every 4 years, that this was part of the polity. Certainly not, this is not an anarchic utopia, but that the mob rule was an accepted practice. Maybe that's going too far, but a practice that did not destroy the regime. In fact, could be understood as supporting the regime. Does that make sense? And this is just the kind of irony that I delight in.
Yes, though let me take issue with some of the terms, because I mean, I counter them very often, and I think it's important to revise them a little bit. So, for example, this isn't mob rule. In the first sense, this isn't a mob. The sources, if you have some like a really super conceited aristocratic author, they will call it a mob. But for the most part, it's just the people of Constantinople, like the populace, as in the English word populace, but also the Latin word populus, from where you get, senatus populusque Romanus, the Senate and the people of Rome. It's the people of Rome are the ultimate criterion for deciding, whether the regime is performing well. So it's the people, not a mob. And they don't actually rule. They intervene. They intervene and they make their wishes known. And they can intervene to overthrow an emperor. They can intervene to create and legitimate a new emperor. Let me make this concrete for the audience. How does one become the Roman monarch in this sense, in Constantinople? Like, how do you become, quote, the emperor? It's not the emperor, the Vasilevs, whatever, right? How does that happen? So, for most monarchies, for most European and Christian monarchies, the audience would imagine some coronation with, I don't know, ointments and things like, prayers and churches and things like that. And over time, those kinds of things were added to the accession of an emperor, but they weren't the defining thing. Those are like, that was the bling of accession. You became the Roman emperor. Like, there's one moment when you're not, and there's one moment when you are. And what mediates between those two moments is a large crowd of Romans calling you like Augustus or whatever, like literally saying, you're now it. And after that, all the ceremonies are just add-ons. They're just like, okay, because they like a show and whatever. So this often happened in the Hippodrome, where you could fit, I don't know, maybe 100,000 people. And so the new emperor to be comes out onto a balcony and he says, I really try to do a good job. And, by the time you get to this point, it's already a sort of settled issue. And they say, yes, Augustus, you're the guy. Things like many years to you, God be with you, all of this stuff. And this acclamation. Yes. And they repeat this like 100 times. And that's it. Now you're the emperor. Right? So that happens every time. It can happen in a Hagia Sophia, the church, fit 16,000 people. Again, it happens in the public squares. In fact, it happens almost every time an emperor makes a public appearance. So the emperor appears before a large crowd, the crowd will chant like, "Hey, yeah, Augustus, 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 Augustus." That means that they're accepting him. If the emperor appears before the crowd in the hippodrome or wherever, and they start booing or calling him unworthy, Anaxios, 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 or dig up his bones, or whatever things, the slogans they chanted, you're in trouble. Like, that's how they let you know that you're now on probation. Like, you better fix whatever it is that was bothering them. And usually emperors would do that very quickly, because otherwise you face the wrath of the populace, and there's very little you can do against them. So that's how it works. It's not mob rule as such. It's a popular intervention to change the personnel at the highest levels of power, and accordingly certain policies like high taxation, failure in war, whatever it may be, that were making the people unhappy. And sometimes the populace wouldn't start the disturbance, but when you have a contestation, so you have a rebel general in the provinces, or some courtier, some high politician who's planning a coup or something like that, the populace will sometimes intervene and choose a side, right? And thereby, so they participate rather than being the protagonists, but they definitely do. So it is anarchy in that sense, that it is political power from the bottom up, from the ground level, that is organized outside of political institutions. It's organized purely through a social dynamic that we can't even access, because our sources don't let us know. They let us know 100,000 people showed up. We don't know how it is why they did that. That is on, like, how did the whole thing get started? Who were the movers? Who are the shakers? Whatever. Who organized them? It's very unclear. And it's extra institutional, but in the terms of legitimating the government, it's fundamental. Like, you can't have a legitimate government in this society without that kind of mass approval. So your audience can think about it in the following terms, and this is sometimes I say in conferences or whatever, and I don't know, leave some people mystified or whatever. But so let's take a modern American society. There are two ways by which the populace at large can intervene in the sort of operations of the political, process. And one is through elections, and that's the one that we are told about. Like, that's your that's your lane. You get in your role as a citizen is to vote, for one of the two pre-approved candidates, not to get too involved in how they're approved or selected in the first place. So that's now sort of opened up a little bit more. But those are you got, corporate guy 1, corporate guy 2, pick. Right? And then go back and watch Netflix or whatever. Just get out of it. We don't want you around too much. Right? And so that's one way. The other way is through mass protest. Right? Just making your will and your presence known through sheer bodily presence, your pressure. Right? And if you think about it, in some respects, method A, elections, are tending to not produce the kinds of results that people want. I think it's fairly safe to say by now that no matter where you are in the American political spectrum, you're unhappy with the kinds of results that the politicians are delivering, the politicians who are elected. Right? And there's another sense in which some of the most important changes in policy, or even just sort of the social modes and orders of this country, were far more affected by peaceful protest, be it racial equality, be it environmental issues, be it whatever, anti-war, be it whatever. That wasn't done through elections. Elections came along to ratify the shifts that were evident in the streets, right? But we still, is there anyone who believes that the normal electoral process is going to produce results, say, regarding climate change? Like, I don't. So,
No, I don't
however,
think
I can,
anyone does.
yeah, but I can easily imagine a scenario where if enough people converge on the physical spaces where the operations of government take place and say, we're not going to leave until you do something about this, that will produce more change overnight than how many decades of, like, anyway, I'm just saying.
You're right. No, you're right on track, Anthony. And then the most famous version of this for me is students are still taught that leaf blower coming now. Students are still taught that Brown versus Board of Education desegregated American schools, but in fact, Brown versus Board of Education did nothing. And then Americans, mostly Black Americans, did something about it, took to the streets, and then later you get, as you say, elections and laws there. And so this is what I would call anarchy. And this brings me back to, again, the irony that supposedly Byzantium is, we still use the word Byzantine, right, to mean a bureaucratic process that we cannot do anything about. And so when you're thwarted by bureaucracy, you say, well, I've got a couple of options. I could take the Byzantine option, which is just sit here and be thwarted by unaccountable centralized bureaucrats, or I guess I could get up off my couch and do something about it. And what your work shows is that, in fact, getting off your couch and doing something about it is, in fact, also Byzantine, which is not to suggest that Byzantium, again, was an anarchic utopia, but that it had the same push and pull as every society does. In fact, there was more democratic pull than there was in many other places at the same time, like, for example, the Frankish kingdoms, if I'm understanding that correctly. And in our imagination, Byzantium is a place with no pull, all push. And that is the kind of thing used by elites to explain why we cannot have mass movements in this country. There's always appeals to history. And it's like, well, you want a world in which people have a say, but look at the Roman Empire. It lasted for 2,000 years, and the people never had a say in that at all. And that is, that turns out to not be true.
That's right. In a certain sense, the Roman Empire might have lasted for that long, especially the Eastern one, which lasted much longer than the Western one. In part because its rulers were in a constant state of terror. It was, as one of the first ones, Tiberius, the first successor to Augustus, he said it's like holding a wolf by the ears. And there was none of this, complacency or security in holding power. It was something that could really only be done successfully by people who were extraordinarily hardworking, who really did care for improving what they could of the sort of material life circumstances of their subjects, insofar as pre-modern institutions allow you to do that. And when you were not good at doing those things, or for waging war to defend the territory or whatever, if you were not good at doing those things, you could be replaced in a sometimes rather grisly way. There are very few out and out sort of tyrannical figures in this story. Now, you sometimes come across these references to, these monsters who sat on the throne of Byzantium and whatever. And, these are even by historians, but they're not experts in the field. And I sometimes write to them on emails, like, which ones do you have in mind? I mean, there were some who were incompetent, and there were a couple who were sort of cruel or whatever, but that's not the norm. But for the most part, they're sort of very hardworking, and very, very keen and eager to be thought of as doing well by their subjects because their lives depended on it. It's very, yeah. Remember, they had no right to the throne. You couldn't even say, well, I was elected. Yeah, I don't know, like maybe my approval ratings are tanking now and nobody likes me and I'm not going to be elected again, but I am president until my term ends because the institution's right. No, there wasn't even that. You could be gone from one day to the next. You couldn't say, but I belong to family such and such. No, there was no such thing. The throne didn't go by family. It didn't go by, there was no right to hold a throne. Similarly, for all of the officers staffing the administration, military, civilian, whatever, when they became unpopular, they were replaced. So sometimes the people would protest in the streets, not against the emperor, but they'd start with lower officials, like the prefect of the city is fleecing us, or so-and-so is corrupt, that judge is corrupt. And almost without exception, the emperors would replace them. Because even if it's not true, they're now a liability. Like, you don't want to go down because this judge is considered to be corrupt.
Well, I mean, awesome. I mean, this is delightful. I mean, and do you feel, I guess, as we're moving towards wrapping up, I'm just curious the extent to which I don't want. Have I distorted your work in this conversation? I don't think I could have, because it's mostly been you, but I just want to make sure or address any potential distortions if you want to.
No, don't worry. I mean, I would jump in if you did. No, the broader discussion we could have at some point is about anarchy and just how anarchic exactly is this. Let me just add that this is a society that regards anarchy as one of the worst evils. Like, it always wants to have people in charge, and it endows them with extraordinary institutional power to be in charge. It just holds them accountable. And so I actually did a word search. We have a database of Byzantine Greek, and I did a word search for all cognates of the term anarchy, and it's always a bad thing. Mm-hmm. Like, it's consistently a bad thing. Now, I mean, that's one side of the picture, right? The other is exactly how it behaves. And since you're treating anarchy in a broader way than a very specific anarcho-syndicalist organization of society, okay. But you're treating it broadly as the kind of power that people, private citizens, can have by collaborating off stage, as it were, and pushing for political change and all kinds of things like that. Yes, absolutely. There's exactly the kind of pull and push that you mentioned, the action and reaction. This is by no means this kind of absolute theocracy, where it's all oppressive. No. In fact, I found out that the government was actually fairly responsive to subjects' needs, and actually extremely eager to be seen as responsive.
You're talking about public relations.
So. Yes, very much so. Very eager to be seen as, I'm really trying, guys. Anyway, but the broader topic of anarchy, that's it.
Yeah, and this is why in my discussion of the recent David Graeber book with some anarchist archaeologists, one of them, Aris Politopoulos, said that one of his colleagues said, "I bet you love that new Graeber book because it was just filled with anarchism." But I don't think the word, if the word shows up in that book, it's like 2 or 3 times, because Graeber is definitely working in this broader sense. And so you could argue, I mean, I'm calling this kind of unofficial series I'm doing, or maybe I'll make it official series, like Excavating Anarchism. And you could argue that entire book is excavating anarchism, but he makes no claims. Graeber would make no claim that these societies were anarchist in a way that Proudhon would have organized a society if he had organized a society. Merely that the authoritarian and autocratic origin of the administrative state has been oversold in our narratives of history, and they are undermining that narrative. And I thought, in that context,
Yes.
Byzantium is another great place to undermine that narrative.
Yes, if you can undermine it there, there are not many other places where it can go and hide.
Yeah.
And you're exactly right in the sense that the narratives of the history of political forms, especially the ones that you encounter in, well, I mean, I don't want to say the Western world, but pretty much anywhere there's a state that's promoting a view of history, right, tend to want you to believe that the official power is either the only thing there is or irresistible.
Mhm.
And that's just not true. And the political history of, the human species is precisely one of that, the pull and push. They're inextricable. And just beware of anyone who tries to persuade you that either there is no alternative or resistance is futile. Like there's no regime in history that has managed to do that. Let's see if the technocrats, whatever. I mean, they're trying to do something like that. You've seen what has happened to the internet over the past 20-some years. So there are always forces that are trying to implement this utopia of control. I don't think they're going to succeed. I hope they don't. But it's important to keep reminding people that sort of passivity and sort of acknowledging the power of institutions is not the only way that we can cope.
Yeah, and then the thing I want to add, lest I be seen as too positive, is the historian Ian Forrest at Oxford has written about how Marxist historians writ broadly love it when the people rise up, love it when there are peasant revolts and things like that. Very often these peasant revolts are themselves autocratic, patriarchal, violent, that sort of thing, and they're just sort of thrilled because since they're using class as an analysis, the Marxist historians get thrilled when it's a different class who is pushing rather than pulling, and that's also a mistake to get too excited about that sort of thing when actually what we're looking for is, I mean, thank you so much for describing my project so wonderfully. The attempt to find the places where anyone can outside of the institutions get involved in changing the world around them in the way they want it to be. And then very often a foot soldier in a peasant revolt took orders exactly the same way a foot soldier in an imperial army did, and that's not the kind of thing that I am. That's not anarchism as far as I'm concerned, in any way, shape, or form. Awesome. So Anthony, thank you so much. This conversation was illuminating, and I really, I mean, the way you closed with the idea that anyone who says that resistance is futile or that change cannot happen has just not been paying attention to history, or what's worse is reading a narrative of history that is written by the people who are invested in change not happening. In one sense, this is a historiographic project. I didn't need you to come on the show to tell me that people actually have a certain amount of autonomy and agency. I already believed that. But historians can assure us over and over again, especially in places like Byzantium, that people do not have autonomy and agency. And it takes other historians to remind us that is not the case. So thank you for coming and reminding us of that.
You're very welcome, Graham. Thank you for inviting me onto the podcast. And I love the show, and so I look forward to your future episodes as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anthony.